There's a place built on a dream. There's a city upon the hill, and its strength lies in its promise, not what it's done, but what it will. America, America, you stand tall even now. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud. America, America, you stand tall even now. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud. You stand tall even now. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud. America, America, you stand tall even now. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud. Your light shines through the valley, even through the cloud.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm Melissa Doherty.
And I'm Cheryl Stallworth. How are you guys? People are still coming in, so we're just going to continue to leave the proverbial doors open. Before we get started, and I guess we'll have to remind people of this throughout the evening, could everybody please mute their audio and turn off their video? If you have questions, drop them into the chat box below. We will be posting key links to content as we go. And for the best experience, view us in speaker mode versus gallery, because I think there are going to be quite a few people on this call. And gallery can be found in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Finally, we want to give a huge shout out to Ruth Bardos, who is our host for this evening. Yay, Ruth. And Ruth has helped us make this happen. I also want to give a shout out to Mel Comer, our dear friend and partner who's out there somewhere. So, hey Mel, how you doing? Thanks for everything.
Yep. So welcome to our very first ShedLight StorySlam. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to all the people who made this possible. So you're going to see a lot of different people tonight, but there are lots of people behind that who were part of a virtual road trip we took earlier. I'll tell you about that in a bit. But thanks to everyone. Our dream, of course, would have been to host this in an event space with cocktails and, believe it or not, other people. But unfortunately not a reality. So we're going to do our best. We're going to do our best to replicate that on Zoom, despite all of the possible tech challenges it could present. And believe me, they are many, especially because we're not the most technical people in the world. But let's hope it won't be a bumpy ride. Fasten your seatbelts just in case. We've already shared our first video. That was by a musician called Samuel Prather, whom you're going to hear from later tonight. And so I guess we're sort of on our way. For those of you who don't know us, I want to tell you a little bit about ShedLight. We are a social impact consultancy that was created to really make sure that the voices of everyday Americans are heard, particularly those who are sliding right out of the middle class. A lot of times, the reason it's super important is that a lot of times the people who are making decisions, such as business leaders, politicians, those in the media, live in a bubble, just like we do. We all do every day. So our work is really designed to get us out of our bubble and to help organizations better serve us, the people, while still growing their business.
It's almost a cliche, Melissa, at this point to say that 2020 was a cultural inflection point, but it was. And I think that one of our interviewees once said that we haven't seen this much change in values in the United States since the 1960s. So given the importance of this moment, we thought it would be important to document it for us as Americans in our own words. So we created this web series of Many One. And it was essentially a virtual road trip. We're really excited about sharing highlights from our road trip, stories, music, and new ideas that emerged based on conversations with everyday people just like you guys. And these people were across the country.
So before we go any further, I wanted to take a second and just raise my little glass of water, which is embarrassing, I know. Maybe Cheryl could raise a glass of wine and we'd feel a little better about it.
I do have a little wine.
But I wanted to toast all the people who contributed this and made it possible, and cheers. So now to begin. One really big theme that emerged was that even though Washington is taking up all the oxygen in the room, right? We the people, right? We've been extremely effective when we focus on helping each other, that at a local level, because that's where things get done, right? That's where things sort of matter in a meaningful way. We have a great talent pool of local leaders, from governors, mayors, city councils, teachers, right? And right on down from there. But we're also inspired by the necessary role and that business, right, will need to play as we go forward over the next years in driving change.
Yes, and our journey revealed that America is becoming more and more complicated. Our rugged individualism and need for achievement make us creative, make us progressive, but universally, the people we spoke to felt that our selfishness and materialism are impeding our progress as a society, and that our freedom is precious and fragile, and it's something that we really have to guard closely. Let's listen.
America is facing a seismic shift, and to get the stories behind the noise, the media sound bites, social media, and big data, we spoke with a cross-section of Americans in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement.
Based on what we heard, if we're to unite this nation, we're going to need to foster change from the bottom up, together. No one is coming to save us. The idea of America is hard, and our promise as a nation is our greatest challenge. While we take immense pride in our independence and freedom, our research reveals that we seem to be ready to develop a stronger sense of we-ism versus me-ism.
This individual thing, which the US was founded on, I get it. And this isn't about socialism or communism or anything else like this. This is just There is a different way of doing things, and it's not always about me. It's about us. We have a lot of Canadian friends, and the Canadians they're bored like we are, but their government has asked them to do something, and they've said, okay. And they bitch and moan about it, but they're not in the streets with flags or guns or anything like that. And we were having a conversation on the phone, and she says, well, you know, the difference between you guys and us is that we got our freedom through evolution. You got yours through revolution. That is a very different way of sort of looking at the way the two countries look at freedom. Mm-hmm. You know, one is I had to fight for all of this. The other is I just let it sort of happen. The English were going to get tired of us anyway. so now that has permeated through our society over the 250, almost 300 years that we have been around. That's kind of how we are. It's about individual rights.
There can be too much of a good thing, even freedom, right? If we're not using it responsibly, then it's too much of a good thing. And so there are other countries that don't have the level of freedom that we have. Until we step outside, we don't understand what a privilege it is. And that if we did understand how precious it was, we would not take such advantage of it.
So as much as the idea of freedom defines the American ethos, the middle class also looms really large in our national mythology. It's that idea that, like, if we work really hard, anybody can rise. It drives us as Americans, and it's attracted people from all over the world to this country.
Yes, and I think one of my biggest takeaways from our work this year, or last year, I should say, is how that egalitarian idea plays out differently across generations. To a large extent, older generations have been able to live out the promise of the American dream a little bit more. And that promise is that through education, the opportunity for gainful employment, and increasing levels of equality over time have led inevitably to a better life. In our research, we heard a few voices whose lives really crystallized the American dream at its best. Let's listen.
We all thought we were middle class. I mean, and everybody in my neighborhood, we always talked about we were middle class kids, but we all lived in those apartment buildings and all that other stuff. So expectations, you know, were really significantly different. We never took a vacation, right? We went and stayed at my Uncle Art's over 4th of July or things like that. He came down, and when he came down, I slept between two chairs because we didn't have enough beds to go around and what have you. We never saw people that had anything, you know what I mean? There were no wealthy people that we knew. Everybody we knew, you know, just worked.
My parents came from the great, well, as did I, the great state of Mississippi. When I was 9 years old, my dad decided he needed to move to Chicago because he had heard there were lots of jobs there, and he wanted to get his two sons out of a place that he believed they would have no life. And so he moved us to Chicago. He gave us a great college education. The one thing that he would always say, though, is, you know, now you need to pay that forward.
The American dream is still alive because I was born in the Dominican Republic. I came here when I was 10. And there's a lot of things that we offer here that are not offered overseas. Like here, if you want to go to college, you take out a loan. But the dream is still alive if you work really hard.
But now, the reality is different. Generations following the silent generation and the baby boom, the Gen Xers and the millennials, have entered a world of low wages, ballooning expenses, and so on and so forth. To give you a real sense of the generational difference, the next segment bookends the story of a millennial Vermont couple, a teacher and a legal assistant, who also both have second jobs, with the story of Bruce, who we saw in the last segment, a member of the silent generation, born between the Depression and World War II. And Bruce is actually on the Zoom. So, hey, Bruce, how are you? Thank you.
You know, my dad owned a gas station, like a mom and pop gas station, and we were probably upper middle class growing up. We drove out to Arizona or Florida every year on vacation. My dad bought a brand new truck every 2 years. They didn't have a credit card. They didn't have an ounce of debt. But I think their house cost like $4,000. You know what I mean? Like,
it's a different world.
So it's so hard because I personally keep comparing myself to that standard, and I'm like, shit, we are a train wreck.
You know, you feel like, oh, I should have myself together, and it's not until like you find like those one or two people where you open up, where you're just like, oh my god, like I don't know what I'm gonna do, and they're like, oh my god, we just got the foreclosure notice on our house, we know, and I'm like, no way, you know, like I call it like the Facebook world, like you present like this best picture of yourself because that's what you want to show.
Like we're in our mid 40s right now. Mm-hmm. We still live paycheck to paycheck, and I know that that's so common, but it still feels to a certain extent like there's some failure. Like, and my mom is the queen about like, well, you've got to put this money away, and I'm like, oh shit. But I also have a washing machine that needs to get fixed. There's trim that needs to, like we're not living an extravagant life. So, post Corona, just figuring out some way to actually get that nest egg, and not even a nest egg at this point, retirement built up so that we don't have to work till we're 80 years old,
The cost of housing and the inability of people to start to build real estate wealth over time. I mean, real estate's been the single greatest investment in my life, right? I mean, it trumps everything from that perspective. We bought our first house, right? It's $22,000. There's no way in hell that people can do that today, and it's too bad. The cost of education is sort of unconscionable at this point, right? For most people. I mean, I went to school and I had not free, but almost free education. And my aggregate cost for going to 4 years of school had to be under $1,500. Yeah, that was really important. And so it changed the equation for my family.
Student loan debt, I'm telling you, that comes back every single time. It's ruined our credit, so that we can't buy a car if we need to. The student loan institution is fundamentally just lodged against people that like us, I think, you know?
I feel like if you're really poor, we could have so many things available for us. Or if we were even $100,000 a year wealthier, we'd have more things available to us. But there's this pocket of the working poor where
middle class.
You are literally the backbone of society as you support everybody else.
It's really incredible, Cheryl. Every time I think about the middle class slide, right? What's happening? Their story, that couple's story, is the story for so many Americans. Even before the pandemic, 100 million people, a group bigger than the baby boom, right? They earn incomes above the poverty line, but every month struggle to pay a bill, put food on the table, or clothes on their children's backs. And that's incredible. These are people who are working 1 or 2 jobs. And yeah, it's a real issue. And
these folks went to college. They thought they were playing by the rules. They refer to themselves as the working poor, which is kind of tough.
I love that. Or I don't love that. It's terrible. But that whole, like, we have to recognize that the middle class, the bottom part of the middle class, considers themselves the working poor. I mean, I think it's an important fact.
And
Yeah.
I think that a lot of times folks that are going through this, their efforts are really invisible. They're our neighbors, they're our friends. They earn too much to qualify for government programs, and they're really embarrassed to talk about their inability to make ends meet. But we believe that there is good news in that if we think about the power that we have in our local communities, we see people doing things to make change. And that's where a lot of the change is probably going to have to come from. Um, that's one of our strengths, I think, as Americans. And that brings us to Nicola. And I know Nicola has also hopped on the Zoom, but Nicola is working on a PhD thesis that could transform one of the biggest problems on the retail landscape into a job creation engine. And I think companies in China are already doing this. Nicola, what's your story?
I'm a graduate student at the Parsons School of Design, and I'm studying fashion management. So we are learning everything from, what companies are doing in terms of branding. We're talking about supply chain. We're talking about entrepreneurship. We're really looking at the entire scope of the industry from a business perspective. So I'm not a designer. We had to pick a topic for our research, and I started looking at real estate in the retail industry. That's how it kind of began. And then I morphed into this idea of like, what can we do with the real estate, the existing real estate that's dead in the industry, and bring back some employment to this country by utilizing those empty spaces. So if you want to talk specifics, my actual thesis statement is American malls can implement technology to increase profits by transitioning anchor stores, which are like and Macy's that's been closed down, to factory/retail showrooms. So that would provide local jobs. It would provide supply chain transparency. Transparency and authenticity are the two big words that we're using in the industry right now. And it would offer the most progressive form of omni-channel, which encompasses manufacturing, so production of your goods, fulfillment, which means storing your goods and then distributing them, and then retailing it to the consumer. So you're creating this creative experience for the consumer in this location, but you're also ticking a lot of other boxes too. So a concrete example would be taking something like the Nike Innovation Lab. Let's say you go online and you can create a shoe that you design. Like you too can go on the Nike website right now and you can design a shoe. Those shoes right now, I believe, are made in China, and they take about 3 to 4 weeks to ship here. Now, if the Nike Innovation Lab were to take a small kind of micro manufacturing facility at an old mall, let's say I'm in the Berkshires right now, there's an old mall that's empty. They open up their innovation lab and you can have the shoe made there, and the shoe can be shipped to the consumer in 2 to 3 days once made. And we're employing people here in this country and in parts of this country where there are many low income and families that are in poverty that need jobs. There's money to be spent. It's just a matter of being creative about it and picking the right companies to bring micro manufacturing here. Now, will a company like H&M do that? Maybe not, because their price point's not there. But companies like Lululemon, New Balance, New Balance already does manufacturing in Maine and Massachusetts. They're the types of companies that can bring that back. And I really think it's their corporate social responsibility to do that. With these micro manufacturing facilities, we have to train these people, and that's bringing them to a different level in their life, right? We're taking you from here and we're bringing you up here by providing this training. And that Amazon can do the same thing with what they're doing here as well, by training Americans and bringing them up to a different standard. This is a unique opportunity to create change for companies. And we really have to, in order to not only protect our own citizens, but to protect our environment and the future of our businesses. So we have this adrenaline rush right now because we're going to get out of COVID. We're going to do the best that we can. So take that adrenaline rush and let's ride with it. I'm a dreamer. I grew up with a mom that was, giving me Anthony Robbins tapes when I was 14, about, positivity and making change. And I really do want to just catch the attention of CEOs of companies and say, hey, it's our turn to take responsibility and make some change. And I would like to maybe just turn their heads a little bit and listen. Even if they don't make that change right away, it's like tucked into the back of their head, and eventually they will.
That's great.
Yeah.
And we have Nicola here. Nicola, would you appear?
There she is.
I'm here. I turned my video back on.
Hi, Nicola. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. And just so you know, it's not a PhD thesis, it's a master's thesis, but eventually I'll get to my PhD. That's
you should accept the promotion. Just
Cheryl's my
I kept thinking I had PhD on the brain.
Cheryl's my my mentor to the next level. Actually, Susan, my boss at Fisher College, is on right now. She was my mentor to get me into the master's program. So you guys are unbelievable. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Nicola, I have a question that's come in for you, but before we get to that question, I mentioned China, and did you tell us that they were already doing something similar to this in China? I'm just curious.
Yeah, they're already using technology in their malls, and they're driving people to their malls. I mean, China in general is doing a great job. I think I mentioned in my interview that, in 2000, I forget the stats right offhand, but a few years ago, they were exporting like 80% of their goods. Last year, I think they were only exporting about 29% of their goods. So they're making their own goods now. They're providing jobs for their own people, and they're providing goods for their own people. They're becoming this kind of insular country. And I think that's where America made a mistake. We didn't protect our own people. We just went after the bottom line. We just saw dollar signs. It seems to be, at least from my perspective, that we've been looking at dollar signs for a long time. And it was interesting to hear Niall Rowan speak at the beginning, because I'm actually Canadian. I grew up in Canada. My family moved to the United States when I was 16. And so I see both perspectives, and you see this right for freedom, but it's also like, we need to get the cheapest item. We need $5 t-shirts, but what has that done? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
We have to think about, what are we going to fight for? We need to fight for the right things and protect our own people while we do it. And I think China's doing a good job of protecting their own people. And now Africa is the next big opportunity for manufacturing. And they are doing an amazing job. You should watch this video from the Business of Fashion, which Laura Lantari is on this tonight. She was the one that
yes, she is.
showed us the video. And it's quite amazing to see the advocates that are coming out and saying, okay, yes, you can come and manufacture here, but these are the rules and regulations around it. We're protecting our people while we're doing this, rather than, sacrificing their lives.
Yeah.
So here's our question for you, and it's probably an unfair ask. We, as the older generation, are really counting on the Gen Xers and the young millennials to make things better. And we probably didn't do such a good job during NAFTA and all of the things that shipped our jobs away. What do you need from all of us in terms of support for this great idea, or any other ideas that you have?
That's a good question. And I think the biggest, what we need is to be open to change and embrace change. I think as humans, we don't want to adapt. We want to stay in like our little cubbies. And I think that's attributed to the problems that we're having with, with Black Lives Matter and, and racism and so on. We've been living this like kind of insular life. And I think just being open and taking into consideration others and taking into consideration other countries and really looking, Melissa said at the beginning, get out of your bubble. That's what we need. We need people to get out of their bubble.
We're here.
Yeah. And I think corporate social responsibility is going to change that on the corporate side. And it seems to be, 10 years ago, the biggest new job was social media. People started with interns. Now you actually have jobs saying, head of social media. Now people are hiring corporate social responsibility like mad, especially after Black Lives Matter and this COVID pandemic and the cancel culture. And I think a lot of growth will happen out of that. But I think the C-suites are going to have to change. The executives at the top level, which are people that are, older and more your age, are going to, sorry, you're not old.
Oh, snap.
You positioned yourself that way, Cheryl. You set
You
yourself
did
up.
position yourself in that way. But listening and changing and being open, and it's gonna have to change at the top, and in order for everybody to listen, because it comes from leaders. A really great book that I'm reading right now is The Toyota Way, and they talk about their lean leadership and how, really everybody needs to be a part of the company and needs to feel like they're a part of the company and feel like they're growing it. And I think we need to do that as human beings and within corporations.
Yeah.
Well,
thank you so much. And it totally also ties into a couple things we're going to talk about as the evening goes on too, Nicola. And I just, as always, inspiring. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So taking a next step forward on our road trip, I guess is the way I would put it. Somewhere in the middle of our journey where we were learning so much from everyday Americans and then some, other people who gave us context. We were in the middle of telling our story, and the murder of George Floyd sort of sent shockwaves around the world. And so in our episode of our web series, it's entitled, Why Doesn't America Love Us Back? We decided to go behind the scenes of the headlines, right? We went and we looked at the long history of policing Black people in America, going back to its roots in the slave patrols of the 1600s.
And the issues that happened in the 1600s or that spawned today, started in the 1600s, continues to this day in the form of seeing Black people as suspicious when they're in the wrong neighborhood, seeing Black people as out of place when they're not in predominantly Black areas. So we did a little research because we wanted to get behind some of the sensationalistic headlines that we were seeing. And we discovered this great study called What Exposes African Americans to Police Violence. It was a 2016 study published in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review. And we will post a link to this paper in the chat, because I think it takes us out of a lot of the, as I was saying, sensationalistic headlines and really helps us understand the long view and the historical perspectives. The thing that's really important is that, Melissa, the protests were about much more than policing.
Right.
One of the people that we spoke to said they emanate from a lack of historical reconciliation. A lot of stuff happened that we haven't reconciled.
Yeah.
And so we thought it would be important to listen to the voices of people who've actually lived this history.
My father was ill after the war. He had been a student at Hampton Institute, historically black college. When he went into the military, I'm sure he was a good soldier in a segregated army, with all the things that he had to endure with the cold weather in France, and then come home and be diagnosed with tuberculosis that soon shortened his days. I think he was in his late 40s, and so I guess we'll never really know the full potential of what he could have been or what he would have become had he not gotten sick. But he too gave all to his country, this beautiful country, as many blacks have, with no recognition, because when my father passed away, he could not be buried in the National Cemetery. Other than the flag, there was no other recognition. He was entitled to it, but not given it because of his race. But he gave all regardless.
So that's pretty painful. With this historical perspective, a profound question was raised by NBA coach Doc Rivers at the height of the Black Lives Matter protest movement last summer. And Doc Rivers' question yielded an interesting answer from one of our storytellers, Ola Mobilade.
It's amazing to me why we keep loving this country and this country does not love us back.
The question is, why doesn't America love us back? I would challenge it in some ways. I would actually break up America and think about it as the people versus the system and structures. Given that we are only 12% of the population, if you can show me one aspect of American culture that is not inordinately influenced by Black people, again, 12% of the population, whether we are talking about sports, professional sports, or food or music, I think that the amount of support and passion and money, even politics, there are so many signs that speak to love affair with Black culture, and I think that will only grow as millennials and Gen Z age up into powerful positions. And I think part of the reason they love us is that we are America. We are the embodiment of the American dream.
So Ola always is eloquent. I know Ola, but I think she also is, it's this idea that despite centuries of injustice and continuing injustice, this whole, and being 12% of the population, Black culture is just so front and center in this country. And there are lots of things we need to bring along, right, to sort of match that, balance it out. Anyway, I think music is a really important piece of that. I mean, Ola mentioned it. Also, our next guest is going to talk about that continuing love affair with Black music. Super powerful medium also for messaging around social change. And in fact, 2020, Rolling Stone listed the classic Marvin Gaye album, What's Going On, as the #1 on the list of the top 500 albums of all time. So,
and it just occurred to me that that album was released 50 years ago. And when you listen to it, it could have been released last summer, you know? And for you folks that are of a certain age, like Nicola, who might not, no, Nicola, I'm sure has heard the album, but for folks of a certain age who haven't listened to the album, it's an amazing piece of art, and they have it at Target on vinyl. So it might be worth checking out. In this spirit, in the spirit of change and in the spirit of protest, we had a great conversation with the DC-based musician and leader of the Go Orchestra, Samuel Prather. Samuel is a multi-instrumentalist whose art intersects with social justice as well as education. And this is what the Capital Bop website had to say about his work. Samuel Prather is a human jukebox. Put in a request and his ensemble, the Groove Orchestra, will lay into seemingly any tune with mellifluous horn melodies, driving funk guitar, and pulsating rhythms.
Groove Orchestra is my attempt at creating, I guess, an art of sorts of history of kind of Black American music in a way. Not even just confined to American, because I do also reach, so it's really more like the African diaspora, you know. Pretty much anything that brown people have played, I try to pay homage to in some way, shape, or form. So I've done tributes to, you know, James Brown, Fela Kuti, jazz drummers like Jeff Tane Watts. So I tend to write tunes that way. I hear kind of people, even sometimes before I hear rhythms or melodies. So the whole thing kind of started at Howard University. I was playing with a lot of the folks that are on the record. I figured out, one, from Chris Funn, that I really like how funk bass lines sound on an upright. You know, I worked with him and his wife, Paige Funn, on the production, Liner Notes. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it basically is like bringing older funk and soul and jazz, connecting it to the hip hop in the present and past that it was sampled from. A really successful preacher might be able to preach to a couple hundred people every Sunday, but a pop artist is literally heard by millions of people. So you want to make sure that everything that you put on record is positive and kind of uplifting to the community, because that reach is just so much more amplified. It's embarrassing to say at this point, but I don't even remember the unarmed Black man killed by police that originally inspired the tune. There have been so many since. But I remember thinking to myself, oh no, I need to put this song out right now. This is the heat of the moment. This is going to be the one that changes everything. Like it's on video. It's so blatant that this use of force was completely unnecessary. And I didn't get the song finished. I didn't get the video finished. And I was kind of bummed about it. I was like, oh man, well, you know, I missed the moment. Could have been the song of a movement, etc. And then somebody else, it happened to somebody else. And then it happened to another person and another person and another person. And, you know, I realized that there is no moment for this song. It's just kind of like what's going on, in a sense, where it's like you don't have to look too far in the headlines to see its relevance. And so I'm glad that I got to put it out when George Floyd was murdered. I think that was a particularly eye-opening moment for a lot of people, because just the sheer brutality of it. It's just one of those things where, as dark as that is, we have to remember, in the same way that King was looking at the newspaper or what wasn't printed in the newspaper, and he found a way to speak about these things from a place of hope. And I think that that is what we really need to continue to do now that these things, which were always happening, have been brought to the public eye.
You can try worry, and you can try fear. You can try pulling the hair out your head and drowning in tears. You can try protest It tests all the boundaries of your faith, attacked by hate. But when you've been pushed to what seems like the end, remember that he'll never put more on you than you can bear. 'Cause love always wins in the end. Love always wins in the end.
So I'm going to let that video speak for itself. It's really moving. We're going to continue our chat with Samuel in a moment, but I'd like to share a question with Cheryl that I have here. It says, I'd like to pick up on Doc's quote, "Why doesn't America love us back?" Cheryl, how would you answer
But
that?
yeah, well, that question is a question that I think we pondered for months, and we interviewed people and actually asked people to answer the question. The response that we got from people was, and this came from young people, which was really heartbreaking, was that America wasn't built for us. This is a quote. Even though we were forced to help build America, we were just merely cogs in the wheel. And I think the explanation is that when you dehumanize people, it makes it easier to hate and mistreat them. And because you don't see them, you don't see their humanity. And I'll just let that settle. But when I think about that question, one of the few things we retained as our humanity was stripped away was our musical heritage. And that's the heritage that is reflected, I think, in Samuel's work. You know, Black music always had some protest built into it, right? Sometimes subtle, like the slave songs, sometimes not so subtle, like Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. And I think, ironically, the music has been such an integral part of American culture that it has really been one of the factors that has brought us together as a nation. Because the music, as I said, it's fundamentally America. It's who we are. So in this spirit, we asked Samuel what he wanted the video, what impact he wanted the video to have, right, Melissa? And this is what he had to say. I think it was pretty inspiring.
Yeah, he is inspiring.
I think the same thing that King was hoping for when he was talking about hope for the future. He was hoping that we wouldn't allow the anger of the moment to poison the potential of the future. Because it's very easy to justify actions that would be irreparable. So if you believe these things from the Declaration of Independence, then you can't be okay with these people's lives being taken and these people's communities being brutalized. It's just about really trying to keep our focus on the things that are going to be not just productive from a policy and actuality standpoint, but from a spiritual standpoint as well, because we don't do ourselves any favors by adopting the damaging spiritual place that these acts come from. You know, being from DC, you know, go-go is the heartbeat of the land, and so I was beating on desks and stuff like that in elementary school, but I also was playing in church. My sister was taking piano lessons, and so I was kind of picking out a couple things by ear. My mother was in a couple kind of local orchestras, and so she played viola and messed around on guitar and piano. And my dad, who doesn't play anything, but had a ton of records, would play everything from Michael Jackson, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Mays, James Brown, just kind of the litany of black barbecue culture. I'm coming from the standpoint of being a terrible reader, sight reader at least, because I didn't have that as like a priority early on in my career. So I wanted to make ways to teach children younger how to sight read, because I believe that much like spoken language, reading should be something that's introduced to children as early as possible. So, I made a rap song trying to harness the power of trap, to teach kids the lines and spaces on the EGPDF, lines on the double left, and try to use the power that hip hop has to teach, right? Because you have people that can't do a number of things academically, but they can recite 4 minutes of rap verses with no problem. So hopefully being able to kind of use that kind of the same way Schoolhouse Rock taught a generation about politics. And then I also try to teach in a way that doesn't come from a purely Eurocentric standard as well, because I think that we miss out on a lot of musicians, and a lot of musicians undervalue their potential because of their inability to operate in what is a very Eurocentric standard in music theory and music instruction. So it's like, I want to play jazz, but I'm being told by, by the education system that I need to learn all this European art music before I can even start learning jazz or funk or soul or gospel. And my ability to read a Chopin etude, even though that's a good thing to be able to do, will do nothing for me if my grandmother were to stand up in a devotion service and sing a hymn in a Baptist church. So there's a lot of people whose skill set isn't valued, and it definitely isn't taught. So I try to kind of keep those things in mind and teach from a cultural perspective. And that changes based on students. So I have a student from South America, but I teach him different things than I would teach a Black student or an Asian student, to get them grounded in their culture first. Because all of our gigs as a musician, at least a professional musician, our first gigs are for who? Our family. If you're Guatemalan and you don't know any of the songs that they would play at a Guatemalan wedding, right, you're already at a disadvantage in your key demographic. In order to get the support from the village that's behind the child, we have to start teaching them songs from the village, is kind of the mindset. Then, once you've got the backing of the village, then you can start introducing these other things that are kind of that European theory aesthetic. But if you're just trying to have kids run scales absent of any cultural context and any repertory context, then I think you'll have less success with getting them to be motivated to play and practice.
That is innovative. I've never heard of that
before.
It
makes total sense. I mean, just listening to you,
but it makes
total sense. The whole idea
right.
of like your first gigs, I mean, that's just so obvious, and I never thought of it.
Yeah. It's
imagine
great.
Imagine playing, studying and shedding an instrument multiple hours a day for 5 years, and then showing up at your first gig in front of your family and bombing because you're not even familiar with. I mean, that's terrible.
That's terrible.
What are you playing? What is
It's great.
So thanks to Samuel Prather for taking the time. We really enjoyed getting to know him. For more information, you can go to samuelprather.com. We're dropping that link into the chat. His album Go is available on his website, and also through like Apple Music, I think, and things like that, but definitely on the website. So definitely support him. The other thing we talked about when we talked to him is he was kind of lamenting the closing of all of the jazz clubs right, during COVID, and literally didn't know where he would play next. So when the jazz clubs open, we all need to, sort of show up, I think, for musicians too. So anyway, thank you to Samuel.
Melissa, I was reading some of the comments and I just wanted to share this because I know you're running point on videos.
Yeah.
John Quinn from Indiana University, he's a professor at Indiana University, has What's Going On in yellow vinyl.
What?
And it's one of the top 5 albums, his top 5 albums of all time. So I just want to say that. Shout out to John. And
good taste.
The other thing is Karen McFarland, another guest on the call, loves go-go music from DC. She just, I guess, wanted us
I think
to
I
know
have
that.
to investigate that because I'm just a novice, just finding out about it. So I think I need to find out more.
Well, the one thing about Samuel's album is that it's got the great, sort of social commentary, but it's also got some really danceable tunes.
Yeah.
So moving along, as part of our 2020 journey, we also focused on the role of business in driving social change. And it's about more than having a diverse board of directors, isn't it? We turned to our friends at the Aspen Institute Business and Society program for their perspective.
Yeah, we talked to them a lot just to sort of hear their thoughts. And Judy Samuelson, who founded that program, is one of the best when it comes to challenging us all to think critically about the role of business. And she does it in a way that's always constructive and creative. She founded that program, as I mentioned, and has also just finished a new book that I definitely want to mention and will also drop into the chat. It's called The 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Value in a Changing World. It's available online, probably wherever you buy books, including your, I like to say, local bookstore, because right now all our local bookstores really need us. So check that out.
And her colleague is Miguel Padro. He's provided a lot of fresh new thinking on complex issues like racism in capital markets and the real purpose of the corporation. But our conversation with them started with a level set on business, what it is, what it isn't, and what we can expect from it.
But I would just start by saying, business is not good or bad. I mean, it's not moral or immoral, it's amoral. It's a bundle of different rules and incentives and kind of also impulses, things that business people have been taught and believed to be true, whether or not they're real or not. And so, it's about unleashing the natural inclination of business leaders to work on important problems.
I think Judy did a good job of describing this, is that at their heart and at their best, big companies, small companies, they're all collective action machines. When we see and experience companies as true collective action machines that are working towards things that we participate in, that we care about, then yeah, we're going to trust them more.
Cheryl, we've got a great example of this collective action right now. We've come off a period with which everyone credits with remarkably fast pace of creating a vaccine, not one, multiple ones. And there's a backstory there, not only about government enabling it, which is part of it, that there was a program to make sure that the government wasn't slowing things down, but also businesses leaning into each other, these drug companies cooperating in the process of unlocking this horrific pandemic or disease or COVID. I think we're seeing some interesting coalitions building today of business leaders around questions that are complex questions around racism and economic opportunity. A lot more work has to go on. And there's some blind spots in there that have to be addressed. But I think there's the promise of it.
So what I really appreciate about that little piece of video is that idea of paring down our definition of companies a little bit to collective action machines, right? It strips away a lot of baggage because we all have some, And it also makes me think about what direction, right? Where are they going to take that action? What direction are they going to go with that? And that kind of gets me to purpose, right? Corporate
Right.
purpose, brand purpose.
Mm-hmm. And so everyone's talking about brand purpose, right? And it's been it's probably a little bit of wallpaper right now because it's been overused. But
Yeah.
I think Judy and Miguel will talk about corporate purpose, which can be translated to brand purpose, which we at ShedLight think of as the mission of a company beyond making money. She talks about it in the context of her book, and she thinks it's a critical rule for business. So let's listen to what they have to say.
One of the rules is rooted in purpose. And I start with a story of a law professor who teaches at NYU in business and law. And she starts her course on corporate governance by getting people to take out a charter. I mean, take out a license of business. And one of the things you have to do is you have to say, what is your company's purpose? And she does this to instruct people that it is a choice that's being made, but purpose is also revealed. It's revealed through how the company performs and the choices it makes when things are challenging, and the kind of trade-offs, where it lands when trade-offs present. And so we've seen some horrific examples of corporate purpose being revealed from, Boeing to Volkswagen in the last, years. But we've also enjoyed stunning examples of companies that were steadfast from the beginning, who clearly understood. One of the ones I write about is Southwest. That's another remarkable example of a company that put employees really at the center because they naturally believed. I mean, Herb Keller, who built that company, really understood. I mean, they are the customer interface. I think there's a lot of examples of companies that have stayed true to their purpose, their mission, and made sure that they were aligning their decision making with that purpose.
There's an evolution around purpose in business that has been happening, but it's not guaranteed to kind of, finish. And we need to make sure it does. Because there's still a model of thinking about purpose in business as being something that is decided at the top and that you drive down through your organization, convince everybody that they need to believe that, or just hire everyone who does and build an organization. And that top-down model of purpose is not very effective as a business strategy. It's certainly not very effective psychologically and in terms of building a culture. And I think the evolution that is happening in some companies and I hope continues to evolve is the notion that purpose inside of a company is something that is also a kind of cooperative and collaborative process where the people inside the organization they're coming to work with their own sense of purpose, their own values, and they need to be able to latch on to something meaningful at the company that helps them express that connects to their personal values and purpose. And so it's a much more kind of symbiotic and reactive type of purpose that I would like to see business continue to evolve towards. Company commitments around racial equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these kinds of things. That is coming from within. That's coming from within the organization. The pressure and the insight, frankly, that you're allowing to surface inside your company to help you, better react. And you have to really break down those power dynamics and go out of your way to create those environments where listening can happen, honesty can happen, and then accountability can happen. And it's not about an executive asking the better question either. It is about this kind of freedom for employees to voice their concerns, voice their insight, voice their observations, and then putting that into practice so that employees can hold you as an executive, you as a manager, accountable. And different companies will have different ways of doing this, whether that's through a labor union or whether that's really just through a really smart way of structuring worker committees on various topics. Maybe it's healthy, start with health and safety. Why not after last year, right? Let's build the capacity inside your organization so that it becomes more natural and a real value add.
And it is a real value add. Let me just pick up on that. I mean, you know, employees are your best allies. They are fully aligned with the long-term health of the enterprise. They want the same things. And they are the best. They are the ones who have their finger on the pulse of the consumer, you know, they are the interface with customer service. They can identify risks earlier than anybody else. They are the eyes and ears of the company. And they also see opportunities. And you unleash the employees and you're unleashing the potential to, you know, do things differently and to make sure you don't miss the mark on something that could be a great opportunity for the company.
So it really sounds like purpose is kind of grown from the inside out. And it's really, I think it's wonderful to think about the way Miguel talks about it too, right? It is something you write down when you start, but that whole sense that it's really dynamic and so much tied to the energy, right, that we see from employees these days.
I totally agree. And so when you think about it, it's employees and it's those unheard voices. Sometimes when merged together can help you define a great purpose. We have one bit of wisdom, one more bit of wisdom to wring from Miguel about an article he wrote last summer during the big demonstrations of Black Lives Matter on corporate governance.
All right, here we go.
For people who aren't familiar with corporate governance, the most basic thing we need to understand is that corporations are centers of power, and they're kind of political entities in and of themselves. There's voting that happens inside corporations. But what makes the voting in corporations so different than what we experience in our kind of civic lives is that you can buy more votes. All you're doing when you're buying a share of stock, you're buying another vote. And so corporate governance doesn't just like reflect inequities in society, it actually multiplies them. Where the wealthier you are, the more stock you own, you have more say in that institution. And so if you can look at pretty much any inequity in society that's economic, and it is multiplied in a corporation. And it's really perverse. So some of the data that I pointed to in that piece, I forget the precise numbers, but even if you're to think of the elites in each racial category, right? Let's say like college graduate households headed by college graduates. White households headed by college graduates own something like 77-78% of all corporate stock in America. Black and Hispanic households headed by college graduates own something like 2.5%. It's stunning, and it's totally disproportionate to population demographics and anything else. And that's amongst the elite. And it's not just biased against racial minorities or ethnic minorities. It's really biased across class in a major, major way. And so that's where power resides in corporations. And again, it's one of these things that once you start peeling it back, the story gets worse. It doesn't get better in corporate governance. I mean, 2%? You know, it's staggering. Two things that I said at the end of that piece that two questions that I raised were, what would corporate governance look like if we really tried to truly address racism and essentially center corporate power where Black and Hispanic and working people participate in it. We participate in the corporate system and we add value. We just don't do it as investors. And so what if you centered corporate voting more around workers instead of shareholders, or tried to counterbalance them? I think we have a lot more collective intelligence and collective innovation and collective potential than we have tapped into. And when we're thinking about business and corporations in particular, I think we leave a lot on the table. And so I just think there's huge opportunity in creating more inclusive and more democratic companies to actually tap into all of this potential that we're leaving on the table with, currently with our kind of top down and command and control type mindset. And I think after all we've experienced in the last year, it's time for us to make democracy really cool again. Let's prioritize it, and let's not only in our civic lives and at the federal level, but in the rest of our lives too, including our work lives and the way we manage our organizations.
Yes, I just add two things. Corporations are not democracies. They're not supposed to be. They're organized for other purposes. The executive and the governing board, they can decide who to listen to. And hopefully they're doing it with a great consciousness about what is absolutely critical to the health of their enterprise over the long haul. And that begins with employees, but it doesn't end there. And the other thing I would say is, we're all a part of this problem. This isn't about, some executive that we wish, that they would do things differently. We make conscious decisions. As consumers, we tend to rebound to price and convenience over all of these things that we say we care about. As investors, what do we care principally about is that our 401ks continue to go up. And there's trade-offs built into all of the decisions we make as citizens, as consumers, and as employees as well. And so, I kind of welcome that conversation as well, to say, where do we each have real kind of agency here? And hopefully we can model for executives what that ought to look like as well.
I always love talking to them because they are both so strong in their perspectives and don't necessarily agree, but they're part of an evolution. And it's also her challenge at the end to each one of us. It's a really important thing. So I want to thank Judy Samuelson and Miguel Padros so much, for the time they spent with us, helping us think through how business might react to both the economic slide of the middle class, to the social justice issues raised by the Black Lives Matter movement, and to any other number of things that will come up as we try to recover from COVID in the next couple of years. So make sure to check out their work at the Aspen Business and Society program. They have their own page online. They have events. They have speakers of all kinds, even online, admittedly Zoom, but check it out. And Judy's book also, just remember to look for that, which is the 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Value in a Changing World. As we mentioned, it's online and it's local. So that's it. I think we're ready to move on to our last sort of segment here, Cheryl.
Yeah. Our final guest would agree with Judy and Miguel that it is crucial to include all voices, find new ways of listening, and be accountable for our actions. Loretta Ross is a professor at Smith College. She's an expert on the call-out culture as well as white supremacy. She is also a pioneer in reproductive justice and has appeared on MSNBC, Good Morning America, BET, and other networks. And she was featured late last year in the Times. She's an amazing woman, Melissa.
Yeah,
and
she's
by
truly
the way,
incredible.
I think she's on the call. Loretta, I don't know.
Oh, yeah?
I think she is. Loretta, I don't know if you want to unmute and share video. If not, we're cool with it. But we want to thank you and we want to welcome you. So we'll keep rolling, and if you decide to show your face, we would be happy. But we're so happy to feature her on StorySlam. Here we go,
right.
Loretta Ross.
Well, the call out culture was brought to my attention by young people because I wasn't that engaged in social media until my grandson indicated that that was the only way to reach him. But once I got there, I saw how mean people were. And so when I asked young people what was going on, they said, "Oh, you mean the call out culture?" And I said, "You named it?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what are you doing about it?" And they shrugged again. So I thought about all the 50 years of social justice activism I'd done, but mostly I thought about the older Black women who never gave up on insufferable me when I was in my 20s and how they called me in. Those of us who throw our opinions into the intellectual commons tend to get a lot of call outs because people react strongly to what we say and we're fearless in saying it. The time I most got called out, though, that I most regret was my fault. I, 25, 30, 25, 26 years ago, was one of 12 Black women who created this theory called reproductive justice. It has transformed the pro choice movement. I'm sure you probably heard of it by now. But there was another woman who was Asian American who decided to put out there very publicly an email that she had created it. I'm not quite sure what this young girl was talking about, but I knew her. She was on my board, so she wasn't a stranger. And I was so hurt by what she had done. I put her on the same email blast she had put the claim on. I figured if she claimed it publicly, I'd blow her up publicly. And the next thing I knew, my staff was running to me and said, "You have reduced her to tears." And then I got cast as the bully.
Mm.
As if, and when I, out of my hurt, I was just trying to defend, like Black women always have to do, our intellectual property. And I've regretted that since. Not only did she leave the organization, but a number of Asian American women left the organization in her defense. It took us years to recover from that. And I've thought so many times, I could have asked her, "Why did you need to steal something we freely gave you?" And handle that totally differently. So that's the call out I regret because I got called out. Well, I think it makes us distrust each other. We're meaner to each other than we actually need to be. We're supposed to have differences of opinion. We're supposed to have debates, but we're not supposed to disagree with people's ideas and then attach them to their moral character and say, just because you don't agree with me, you're a racist person, you're a toxic person, you're a manipulative person. And then we exaggerate the harm. "Oh, you have wounded me, you have raped me, you have violated me." And then we attach a whole thing of contamination to it. "Oh, if you hang out with so and so, well, you must be manipulative, toxic, or racist too." And then we put it out on social media so that we can get them mobbed. And then we want them canceled so that they lose their jobs. Well, I think a lot of people are tired of it. I think I'm just the one that 5 years ago that said I can write a book on it. But once I started doing the research, I discovered that most Americans are tired of people using free speech to be intentionally mean to each other. I think that as a society, we're saying there has to be a better way than this. There has to be better way than letting a deranged demagogue split our country in half and bring democracy to the brink of extinction. There has to be a better way. It it it's a framework whose moment has come. We have to figure out why we should rethink the decision to blow up other people's lives simply because we don't agree with them. It goes too far. I teach calling in and calling out. You have to decide who should be called in and who should be called out. So it's not a universal one size fits all band aid or approach for every situation. I have no problem calling out people who absolutely have embraced fascism and racism as a way of life. They're proud to be fascist, they're proud to be racist. Oh no, I've got a totally different calling out strategy for them. But I don't think that's the majority of the 71 million voters. I don't think that's the majority of how people want to walk through the world. And so the way I deal with those is to go underneath their words and sometimes even their behaviors and ask about their values. And I look at them as human beings. And so they usually have the same kind of fears I have. I want my children to be safe. I want my water to be safe. I want my community to be healthy. I want jobs. I mean, when you start talking about those things that make us human beings together, so I can talk to anybody walking around with an American flag, maybe not a Confederate flag, but an American flag, and say, what does that flag mean to you? Let us talk about the values that we probably share underneath all of that and see that we've just arrived at different solutions. But that doesn't make us enemies no more than my brakes are the enemies of my transmission. We are all on the same team, even if we have different solutions for different needs and problems.
Always so great to hear from Loretta. So thank you for the first of our multiple sort of interviews, conversations.
So we have a question, and I'm going to toss this to you, Melissa. You have interviewed a lot of people, and you've had some difficult interviews. Who have you interviewed that you wanted to call out?
There have been those. But I think it's such a good question because our job is really about basically listening to the stories of everyday people. And you're not necessarily going to agree with everyone. But let's really think about, the people. So there are people I've talked to who've literally made my stomach turn. And the interesting thing is, as Loretta was alluding to, most people, when you get underneath what they're saying, which often has to do with stereotypes that are repeated within their own bubble and all that, when you get underneath what they're saying, and it's really important to do that, right? To keep talking and to go beyond those stereotypes. I just think that underneath it all, we're all human. And one of the interesting things we saw recently, and I know I'm not quite answering the question yet, but one of the things I saw recently is a website a couple weeks ago called Facing Humanity. And what they did during the presidential election is they literally put, in the same way we try to tell stories, right? They literally put immigrants on the phone with voters, like on Zoom. And I think things like that, that get people, remember the bubble, that get people out of that bubble and let them hear other people talk and start to break down some stereotypes are really important. I mean, a tangible example is something like guns, which I have trouble wrapping my mind around, right? Why people want them and use them and everything else, but they represent tradition to some people. They represent, a way of being outdoors to others. And for some, they represent a set of things that I don't really am not a fan of at all. But we have to keep talking, and you can't just walk out the door or raise the pitch in the room. You have to keep talking, because if you want someone to if you want the opportunity to change minds ultimately, right, you have to know where people are coming from.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up with Loretta and then call it a night. Loretta conducted something called the National Atonement Tour with the former national spokesman for the Aryan nations. I don't think that's something I could have done, but let's listen to the story because it's interesting.
All right, I'm going to need another second on this one. It's being a little temperamental.
Stretch.
All right, here we go.
Well, you mentioned Reverend Vivian earlier, and one of the other famous things he said is that when you ask people to give up hate, you need to be there for them when they do. And that was while I was working at the National Anti-Klan Network, renamed the Center for Democratic Renewal. And so we encountered and helped deprogram a guy named Floyd Cochran, who had been the national spokesman for the Aryan Nations up in Idaho. And Floyd had been kicked out of the Aryan Nations because his second child was born with a cleft palate. And his Nazi buddies told him that his son was a genetic defect who needed to be put to death. And that was kind of like Floyd's wake up call, like, oh, God, who am I hanging out with? I had no problems hating Black people and Jews, but now it's coming from my child kind of thing. And so Floyd had recruited these two brothers named Freeman from Allentown, Pennsylvania. They were like 16 and 18 when he brought them into the Aryan Nations. And despite all of these warning clouds, they came home one day and murdered their entire family, the mom, the dad, the 12-year-old son. Floyd felt unbelievably guilty for this because he knew how he flipped the Freeman brothers. He knew he was responsible for this. And so he conceptualized the National Atonement Tour. He had been the chief national recruiter of skinheads into the neo-Nazi movement since he was 14 years old, and he was in his mid-30s by then. So he knew the crimes people he had recruited had committed. But it was the Freeman brothers that really pierced his heart. He took responsibility for that. And so he wanted to go around the country, speak to people, particularly young white kids, to persuade them not to join the neo-Nazi movement. And when I got to know Floyd, as I was at first afraid of him, I mean, he was one of the most famous Nazis I knew. I wanted to hate him. But once you get to know people and see their hearts underneath their words and their behaviors, then you change because you change how they see them, how you see them. I found myself developing respect and appreciation for some of the most undeserving people. I didn't do it because they deserved it sometimes. I did it because I deserved to see them better. Calling in is actually pretty easy if you have the tools. The first and best phrase I use all the time when somebody says something that lands badly or awkwardly on my ear, I'll just say, I beg your pardon. And I look at them and it makes them review what they said in their own head. And next thing you know, they're self-editing. I haven't called them out. I paused my reaction to what they said and gave them a chance to self-assess. That's the best tool you'll ever use. Another thing you can use is the offer of further conversations. So you can say, oh, when you used that word the other day, I'm not sure if I understood what you meant. Do you mind if we have a coffee together to further talk about what's going on with you so that you chose to use that word? Because I'm still trying to understand and appreciate you. So you're not ignoring the harm, you're calling their attention to it, but with love, respect, and an offer of further conversation instead of, you said so and so and so and so, so you must be da 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 da. When COVID happened, the first thing I started thinking about was how I could make what I teach to these very privileged kids at Smith available to the general public. So my first class was called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump, because that's what I teach at Smith. And I made it for $5 a lecture. I had never taught online before. Within 48 hours, 500 people had signed up. I had to cut off the registration. After I finished that 4-week lecture, people said, well, what about the calling in stuff, Loretta, you're talking about? So that became the next class. And so I've been going on since then, teaching it online, because these are basic lessons of how to get along in a pluralistic society that we all need and we all benefit from.
So
So
Yeah. I
No,
gotta say
go
thank
ahead.
you. I gotta say thank you. I always really appreciate that. And I also forgot to mention earlier that on Loretta's website is the class, right, as well as everything else. And people should definitely check out that class. Hearing
Yeah.
her talk about it, it just reminded me. I think those look amazing. Have not been, but look amazing.
It's interesting that Loretta and Samuel were born 30 years apart, and they both referred
Yeah.
to the beacon of love and humanity, very much in the vein of King, as the way they have chosen to walk through the world. I mean, Samuel wasn't even born when Martin
Right.
Luther King was assassinated. So, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, that's true. That's amazing. And they both connect. And I think it's interesting to connect both of those back to. I also appreciated the way that at the beginning when we were talking to Nicola, she also connected forward to some people. So it was nice to sort of hear people's voices and see that happen. But I totally agree with this whole fact that people are making a choice about the way they decide to walk through the world. And I mentioned Loretta's courses as a way to sort of keep track of that. She is having a book that's going to come out. It's not available yet, but you should definitely check her website for that. And that's in the chat. That's kind of it. That's our first Story Slam. I hope you get a sense of the kind of work we do. When we're liberated from Zoom this summer, we're going to head south, I think. It's not exactly clear what we're going to do, but we're going to head south and try to sort of, our process is to hear some stories from people first, right? To start with people's stories and then build back to some of the commentary that you've seen tonight. So we'll start with collecting some stories. But definitely check out stay tuned. You can follow us. You can send us a follow-up email. We'll also be emailing you with all of the links from tonight because we want you to have the links to both the full-length interviews as well as this presentation. And we're just very excited everybody came.
We'll go through all the questions, we'll post answers, and people can keep up with our projects, right? On YouTube and on our website. Yeah.
And LinkedIn. Check LinkedIn.
And
We'll always post there.
Yeah, lots of stuff on LinkedIn. I want to thank everyone that was part of Many One. And I also want to thank all of our guests tonight, Nicola, Samuel, Judy, Miguel, Loretta. But wait, there's more, and then we're going to let you guys go. We have closing credits, which credits everyone that was a part of this, so you don't walk out of the theater during the credits. And here are a few brief parting thoughts on what everyday people had to say about the future impact of this moment in time. Thanks a lot, and have a great night.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things where I think if the American public are watching it, it's going to be hard for the collective leadership to go back to a status quo because
the status quo wasn't working.
The status quo wasn't working. There's been a lot of things where, they said, you couldn't work from home. It wasn't possible. People are working from home. Mm-hmm. There's no money for a bailout. Well, you found all kinds of money for a bailout. There's no money for healthcare.
During this time when we were really trying to, basically brace for the impact, we were, working with a lot of different insurance companies, and social work was able to really get, patients who didn't need to be in the hospital out of the hospital. It was the fastest I've ever seen any said entities in social work move. And I'm like, okay, well, if you can do this on a regular basis, then we can continue to do this in the future. We can't go back. I think we can raise the bar now. We know what you can do. You've shown us as a medical provider, we all want people to have insurance. It's good for them. It's good for us. It's good for everybody.
Although this is a terrible time, economically, with health, with the protests, everything that's happening with, it's a terrible time, but it's also, I think, kind of like a moment for us to really start new values and start to reassess and really see how we want the country to move forward. I think there's more participation from different people in different areas, whether that's, you know, they're trying to change the way the health system works or the way the justice system works. Like there's more leadership, I think, that's going to arise from all of this.
So I was a U.S. history geek, and I majored in U.S. history, taught U.S. history for 6 years. So very proud of who we've been and who we can be. And I always had in my head that we were a country that recognized its mistakes and its problems and kept pressing forward. And we've lost that over the last many years. And so I hope that we're refinding it.
Right.